Lord Patten of Barnes needs very little introduction, but for those of you who don't know who he is, he was the chairman of the Tory party between 1990 and 92, the 28th and last governor of Hong Kong between 92 and 97, Chancellor of Oxford University from 2003, produced the Patten Report in the 1990s, chairman of the BBC Trust 2011 to 2014, and offered the honour of Commander of the Legion of Honour in 2016. Of course, for other people, he's the whore of the East, the serpent of the East, if you happen to be a Chinese leader in the 1990s. There is, funnily enough, a website called VIP FAQs, frequently asked questions. Two of the questions that caught my eye about Lord Patten: is there a Chris Patten action figure? Well, there probably should be, but maybe that's yet to come. And is Chris Patten hot? Well, I'll leave you to decide that, ladies and gentlemen. We're certainly going to hear a lot of interest this evening as he gives us his thoughts on the politics of identity. Please welcome Lord Patten of Barnes.
Thank you very much indeed for that very kind skid through my obituary. It's a lot friendlier than an introduction I had a couple of months before Christmas in Manchester, when the introductory speaker, I'm sure meaning well, recounting the things I'd done, finished up by saying, you see, Lord Patten has had a very checkered career, which sounded as though I'd spent some time in McGilligan or Wormwood Scrubs. It's always, as you know, a bit dangerous to start any speech with a question, particularly a rhetorical question. Harold Wilson got into terrible trouble in an election meeting once by beginning his remarks by saying, I want to speak to you tonight about the Royal Navy. Why do I want to speak about the Royal Navy? And somebody shouted out, because you're in Chatham. The first time I spoke at the Rotary Club in my own constituency in Bath, I said to the president of Rotary, when I stood up, I said to him, how long do you want me to go on for? And he said, well, you go on as long as you like, but we all leave at 2:15. Nevertheless, despite that warning to myself, the question I start with is, why was I very keen to come here tonight? Why was I keen to and felt honored and delighted to have this invitation? Because so many of you here and so many of you represented here have done so much to support and drive forward what I think has been one of the most important developments in British politics, in the politics of our archipelago in the last few years. I'd like in particular to salute the work of both the commissions who've done excellent work, and I'd like to pay a particular tribute to Michael, who is going off tomorrow to be manager of Chelsea, who's done 8 years hard and distinguished work for the Equality Commission. I'd like to thank all those voluntary organizations, all those organizations who represent what we call loosely civil society, who've been involved in the process as well. There are some whose work I know particularly well from over the last few years. A great friend of mine has been very involved in the Integrated Education Fund. I know about the work of voluntary organizations like MenCap and others. I know about the work that's been done at the local level in communities, women's groups, other groups, churches. An American who's interested in Northern Ireland said to me a year or so back that he was interested, that he thought that Northern Ireland was one of the few places he could think of where the community was ahead of the political leaders. And without being rude to any political leaders, I think over the last few years that's probably been just about correct. And you have, between you, started to heal the divisions in a society which was, alas, a victim of the often reckless and pretty destructive way in which we've shared this archipelago for 200, 300, 400 years. I think that what has made life so difficult in Northern Ireland for such a lot of the time is a particularly toxic example of what political scientists call identity politics. What Armin Malouf, who I'll refer to again in a moment, called the panthers of identity politics. The way in which very often oversimplified versions of people's identity enable them to feel justified in forgetting about any concept of consent or any sense of civic humanism in a society. And I think that what you've done in sustaining the Good Friday Agreement, in arguing for the Good Friday Agreement, implementing the Good Friday Agreement, implementing lots of things that followed from the Good Friday Agreement, like the Policing Commission, is nothing short of admirable. And I really want to congratulate all who've played a part in that process. When I came to Northern Ireland first as a junior minister in 1983, I was here as a junior minister from 1983 to 1985. I, of course, understood about the difference between the nationalist Republican tradition and the Unionist tradition. And I knew that they were both Catholics and Protestants. I speak as somebody who's a cradle Catholic, married to a member of the Church of England. And I suppose it's fair to say that initially there were several examples which I could have taken as proof that the divisions in Northern Ireland were about religion or about religious loyalties. I remember at my first press conference, a young female journalist said to me, "Could we ask you, Minister, what it's like to be part of a mixed marriage?" As though I was married to a Martian or somebody from outer space. I made a tremendous fuss was made when I went to my first civic lunch in Derry or Londonderry, depending on whether you're a rugby player or a soccer player. I remember at the end of lunch, or the beginning of lunch rather, the bishop gave grace, and at the end of grace I made the sign of the cross, which I'd been doing ever since I was about 4. And it caused some consternation and got me a photograph on the front of a newspaper. It was even often the question of my religion and other people's religion, the subject of jokes. One of my first meetings with an MP was to discuss the health service in Bandside in North Antrim. And there was a delegation led by Dr. Paisley of local people, particularly from Ballymena, to complain about the health service. And like a good, hard-working junior minister, I'd read everything there was to read about the health service in North Antrim. I knew more about the health service in North Antrim than any human being has ever known. I could have gone on mastermind on the health service. But I had to admit to myself, being having limits to my vanity, that the slight problem was I'd never actually been there. So I showed off for a bit with this delegation, showing that I knew about waiting list times and A&E statistics. And then I said, with this display of modesty, but I said, I have to confess that I've never actually been to Ballymena. At which point Dr. Paisley cut in and said, "Confess," he said, "not to me you don't." So I was aware of the fact that religion did play some role as what social scientists and computer scientists as well call identifiers. Now, I had some difficulty with this because I could never actually believe that the argument was about Luther's 95 Theses. or about transubstantiation. And if I'd been asked, I'd have had to admit that my favorite hymn was Luther's magnificent "A Mighty Fortress is Our God, a bulwark never failing," which might have got me into trouble with some people. But I could never actually believe that a religion which believed in the Sermon on the Mount, which believed in Christian charity and turning the other cheek, would actually enthusiastically go about kneecapping either with a Black & Decker drill, which I was told was the preferred way of doing it within one community, or a shotgun, which was preferred by another. So what was this problem of identity politics? Admittedly, with religion being one of the identifiers. I very much agreed with one of my greatest friends and one of the men whom I've most admired in my life, now alas, with his maker, Maurice Hayes. Remember Maurice Hayes, who was brave and wise and funny and ironic and better read than anybody else I'd ever known, partly because he hardly ever slept. I remember Maurice saying to me, "It's about power," he said. He said, "I'll tell you a story." He lived in Downpatrick, as some of you will know. And a family was moved into the house next door who'd been burnt out of they were Catholics, of their home in North Belfast. And Maurice is in the garden one day, and he hears the kids playing next door. And one little girl says to her siblings, "Come on," she said, "it's my turn to be the prod now." And Maurice leans over the fence and says, "Mary, what do you mean it's your turn to be the prod now?" And she said, "It's my turn to have a go on the swing." And we all know how the political system in Northern Ireland was based, let's be frank, on a rather crude notion of majoritarianism, which until the power-sharing executive and until other changes that have been made, put on one side the notion of the consent of the minority and the importance of avoiding the society looking as though it was stacked in one side's, the majority side's, favor. And it was, of course, a particular problem for policing, which was seen to be the, as it were, the bulwark, to go back to Luther, the bulwark of one side. So when I went to the Balkans a few years later as a European commissioner, and people told me that the argument was about language, well, it wasn't. They all spoke the same language. That it was about a clash between the Orthodox and the Catholics, it wasn't. What it was about was something brutally simple. The Serbs didn't want the Croatians to run Croatia, and the Croatians didn't want the Serbs to run Yugoslavia. And in the middle, the Bosniaks, Muslims, were trapped and were murdered by the 10,000. It was about power. It was about identity, certainly in one sense, but people identifying their community with the community that had to be on top. Now, I became increasingly interested in this issue of identity politics. And I read over and over again books on the subject. I read a wonderful book by a French-Lebanese Christian Arab writer called Armin Malouf, who's a great novelist, wrote a book called In the Name of Identity, in which he exposed some of the appalling consequences of identity politics, which took over really at the turn of this century once again from the politics of ideology. And Armin Malouf says at the end of his book that normally when he finished a book, he hoped that his grandchildren would read his novel and think it was a good one. He said, with this book, I hope that if they ever pick this up from the shelf, they'll say to one another, did people really have to write books about this in those days? I then read Amartya Sen's fantastic book, Identity and Violence, which begins with him describing his first recollections as a child of a Muslim being chased through his parents' front garden in Delhi, pursued by a Hindu mob and chopped to pieces on the front lawn. I then read, and one of these authors has had more effect on me and my views on the world than anyone else. I read two great Austrians, one novelist called Joseph Roth, and the other a man called Stefan Zweig, both middle-class Jewish intellectuals, both of them who fled their own country with the growth of extreme nationalism in the 1920s and 30s, which led, of course, to class war, to communism, dictatorship, to fascism, and to the death of literally millions of people. For Zweig, this extraordinary translator, poet, dramatist, it was particularly appalling as Europe was turned into this moral as well as political and economic rubble. Zweig describes in his book how at the beginning of the last century he thought that Europe represented the very peak of civilization. And then he describes what happens with that dog-eat-dog nationalism, with protectionism, with some of the crudest sorts of identity politics. He fled from Austria, fled Europe, went first of all to America and then to Brazil. And he wrote his great book, The World of Yesterday, in 1942, sent it off to the publishers. And the day after he sent it to the publishers, he and his wife committed suicide because he couldn't bear what he saw happening to this European civilization. And that was before the 1C conference organized the murder of 6 million Jews. He would have been amazed at how Europe was put together again as a civilization in the years after 1945. So, with that knowledge of, or interest in identity politics, I was particularly interested in how you set about dealing with the issue here with some extraordinary leadership, I think, from some politicians, not just Northern Ireland politicians, but American like George Mitchell, and European as well, and with Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern working hand in hand to try to sustain the agreement that was eventually reached. An extraordinarily sophisticated agreement in which people understood that identity isn't something you can put in a little silo. An agreement which made this assumption that if the majority community accepted that the minority did not have to show public obeisance or loyalty to the institutions of the state, they could do that provided they accepted that the institutions of the state could only be changed through democracy, through consent. An extraordinarily sophisticated way of handling the question of identity, the recognition that people have a broader identity, an identity which encompasses civic humanism, and not just an identity which is based on the narrowest sort of attempts to explain who they were. And I guess I was encouraged in my interest in identity and its complications by thinking about myself. I guess that my identity, like most of yours, is pretty complicated. I'm very often described in the tabloid press, which covers some of the other newspapers as well these days, very often described as a Tory grandee. My mum would have been tickled pink. Like, come from a lower middle class suburb in the west of London, on the arterial roads going west. My great-grandfather was born in 1829 in Roscommon in Boyle, where the population today is lower than it was when he was born. He came to work in England, first of all, as the repairer of cane chairs, then got into the weaving industry. My grandfather, one of his children, went to teacher training college, where he met my grandmother. They both became head teachers in primary schools in Ancoats in Manchester, an industrial suburb where the teachers and construction workers were Irish, and where the ice cream was made by Italians from Liguria, who also produced the priests. He married my mum. They met at a gig because my dad left university to the horror of his parents to play the drums in a band. And they had really sophisticated gigs in those days. The most important and exotic of them was playing every summer on the Isle of Man. My dad and mum met at a dance in Exeter. My mum fell in love with my dad. They got married to the horror of her parents, whose wonderful daughter was not just marrying the drummer in a band, not just marrying a Catholic drummer in a band, but marrying an Irish Catholic drummer in a band. I grew up as in a lower middle class background. I'm entirely a product of social mobility and of scholarships. I went from a Catholic primary school on a scholarship to a secondary school. I went on a scholarship from there when I was 16 to university, and I owe the rest to good luck and that system of social mobility. But you can't really pigeonhole me. There are one or two curious things about me, like the fact that insofar as I'm interested in football, I support Blackpool. Otherwise, conservative, moderate conservative, pro-European, Catholic, rather argumentative Catholic. So how do you pigeonhole me? What's my identity? I think what you did in the Good Friday Agreement, as I said, was a sophisticated way of tackling that issue. Now, afterwards, when the agreement had been signed, I'd come back not long before from Hong Kong, and I was speaking in New York, and the phone in my hotel went rather too early one morning, and it was Mo Mowlam on the phone. Mo Mowlam, who I think was a very good example of the importance of character, of personality in politics. And Mo Mowlam talked to me a bit about the Good Friday Agreement, and then she said, I'm going to ask you if you do something which I know you won't do. So I said, what's that? And she told me she wanted me to chair this commission on policing, because the one issue which the politicians couldn't agree on was policing. So she's talked a bit about it for a moment, and she said, you know, everybody tells me you won't do it. I said, I'll do it. So she said, don't you want to ask your wife first? So I said, sure, but I'll do it, because I think she will want me to do it as well. And I look back on it. I look back on the criticism at the time. Norman Tebbit said I was doing it for 30 pieces of silver. I should be so lucky. Others said that I shouldn't do it because what I was doing was taking responsibility for solving one of Tony Blair's most difficult problems, and I was a different party, so I shouldn't do anything for him. But I've never got more satisfaction out of a difficult job than I got out of that. It is the most difficult thing I've ever done, and in many respects, the one of which I'm most proud. Lots of aspects to it. I won't go through them all, but I had to learn about an awful lot of issues, from the relationship between policing and human rights. I had to learn about training of police. I had to learn about public order policing. I had to learn about funding of police, all that and much more. But above all, we had to deal with the question of how policing could reflect that quite proper blurring of identity, or broadening of the concept of identity, which underpinned the Good Friday Agreement. And the people who were most adamant that I should do that were the Northern Ireland members, the two Northern Ireland members of my commission. Two people whom I admired hugely for their intellectual integrity. Maurice Hayes, I've already referred to, and Peter Smith, who should have got a great deal more credit for it than he ever did. And we had support from others, for example, Cathy O'Toole, who became the police ombudsman for the Garda Síochána, Sir John Smith, who was a deputy chief of the Metropolitan Police. Others played an important role, but at the heart of it was Maurice and Peter saying, you can't duck the big issues. You can't allow politicians to, when they're talking about the emblems and symbols of the assembly, to take account of different community interests and different community loyalties, but insist that the police should just be identified with one set of symbols. I think we got it right. I think it was very important that when Peter Mandelson and one or two others tried to fudge those issues, people said to them, we want Patten and nothing but Patten. They hadn't always said that in the past, I have to say. They'd said other things about me. But I think it's worked extraordinarily well. That is, of course, partly because of your understanding and support, and it's partly because of the leadership of the police. Now, there were three things which I think we were right to do in relation to that report. And I think they're relevant to some of the political issues which you face in Northern Ireland and which we face in the United Kingdom today. The first is the importance of transparency, of being open about what you're doing. I said we should have public meetings all around the province, and people said nobody will come. Did they come? They were pretty hot occasions, and sometimes reminded us of the difficulties which we were asking some people to face up to. I remember a very tough meeting in Kilkeel, and looking forward to a glass of whiskey back in the flat in Hillsborough. I was very keen to end the meeting. We were up on, I think the cinema's been closed now, somebody told me. I think it's used for an art gallery. But it was like the cinema, do you remember that film, Cinema Paradiso? It was like that. We were sitting up on a high stage with a completely divided audience of about 300 or 400. And at the end of it, I made a pretty little speech about reconciliation and healing and hope. And the lady at the back put her hand up and said, before you go, Mr. Patten, before you go, can I ask you a question? It's always the killer question, the last one. So she got up and she said, you come over here and make speeches like that, and you do it very nicely, and I'm sure you mean it. But you should understand how difficult it is for us sometimes. She leant forward and she touched the man in front of her on the shoulder. And she said, this man here killed my son. And it was true. He was one of those who'd been let out as part of the Good Friday Agreement. And it's very easy when talking about these issues to forget the consequences of the intimacy of violence and how brave individuals have to be in standing up to it, in turning the other cheek. But I think it was right to be transparent. I think it was right that we were honest about the difficulties that we had to face and we had to deal with. And I think we were right not to fudge things. Now, transparency and honesty and an absence of fudge all seem to me to be decidedly relevant to some of the problems that you're facing, that we're all facing in the glorious Brexit future. And I don't, the die is cast, as Caesar said when he crossed the Rubicon. And I don't want to rake over old ground which has been camped on and spat on too much. But all I will say is that I was fairly shocked last week, or 2 weeks ago, by the sacking of somebody who seemed to me to be probably the best Secretary of State for Northern Ireland that the province has had for years. For years. Apparently, if one is to believe what one reads in the newspapers, which is sometimes a good idea, sacked partly because he told the truth. That Brexit without a deal with the European Union would be extremely bad for Northern Ireland. That the deal which the Prime Minister had signed up to, having stood in front of a DUP conference and said that this was something he could never do, that deal does actually involve a border down the Irish Sea. There's a concept in the early history of the church, which you probably know about, consubstantiality, whether Jesus can both be a man and God. Well, it's all very well to talk about consubstantiality in theology, but it doesn't exist in politics. You can't both be in the customs union and outside the customs union. And the deal which the government now say they're going to get out of, heaven knows how, makes trade in goods from the north to the south and the south to the north easier than from the east to the west and from the west to the east. That's what it says. And just by changing the Secretary of State, and I wish the new one well, just by changing the Attorney General, who give you the legal advice you want to hear rather than the legal advice which is legal, that doesn't change what's been agreed. And if we're to keep this union stable as well as prosperous, if we're to treat people decently and honorably, we have to be honest about what has been negotiated in their allegedly interests. So I think there are some lessons that I certainly learned about life from the Policing Commission. I just want to make one more point before, I better not make it. I'll make it very briefly, telegrammatically. I was faced with another question of identity in Hong Kong, where the issue was simply this, that the people of Hong Kong, the citizens of Hong Kong, who the Chinese communists never liked to think of as citizens, wanted to define their Chineseness in relation to the same values that we all share. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, the rule of law, accountable government. And the struggle today is because Xi Jinping has been tightening his grip in China and wants to tighten his grip on Hong Kong. Hong Kong's future was negotiated on the basis of one country, two systems. And I fear that what the Chinese Communist Party wants to do is have one country, one and a bit systems, or even one country, one system. So the question of identity there is of people who spectacularly identify themselves as Chinese, but Chinese with a belief in freedom and with a belief in the rule of law and with a belief in democracy. Now, what can we all do about these things? Well, we can do quite a lot. There was a great Chinese historian who noted what we could do as individuals. He said that the refusal of one decent man outweighs the acquiescence of the multitude. We can make a difference by working together with others, as you've done in Hong Kong, not only as we've done in Hong Kong, and you've done here in Northern Ireland. By the work you've done to build bridges across the divide in the community, and to keep those bridges in working order. And we can make a difference by recognizing, both as a political elite and as individual citizens, what I've always thought is the most salutary advice about politics that I know. There's a great historian of Marxism, a Pole called Kolakowski, who lived in Britain for many years because he was exiled as a dissident from Poland. He was a great guru for the solidarity movement in Poland. And he once wrote, "In politics, being deceived is no excuse." I think we do have responsibilities as citizens. I think we can make the world a better and more honest place. And I think we can insist that those who govern in our name are honest with us when they do so. So, what did I learn in Belfast and Northern Ireland? Much of that, so thank you very much indeed.
So, ladies and gentlemen, the format of the rest of the evening is as follows. Lord Patten and I will have a bit of a chat, maybe for a few minutes, but we're anxious to get your input into the evening. I know you will have many questions on many, many different topics. I'm sure you're dreading them all. So please let me know that you want to ask a question by putting your hand up, and we'll get one of the mics to you. And when you stand, please tell us who you are and if you represent an organization or if you don't, just so as Lord Patten might know where the question's coming from. But I'll start the ball rolling. Do you not worry that you're hopelessly optimistic about the whole thing? I mean, you must remember that we've only just got back into Stormont after 3 years of division, terrible division, which came about because of a complete lack of trust between the two political communities. And before that, 10 years of absence. The Assembly has been sitting for less time, or not sitting for less time than it has actually sat. So, where is the evidence that much progress has been made?
Well, I take everything you've said, but I can tell you, coming back to Belfast, which I haven't visited for a few years, which I first came to in 1983, one is aware of not just a transformed city, but a transformed political culture. I used to spend my life with 4 extremely agreeable policemen. I was on a death list. I can remember waking up one morning when I was the duty minister at Stormont, hearing the Lambeg drum beating, with a huge demonstration to march up the hill and to protest against the fact that I was the minister who'd had to agree that it was legal for the district council in the Londonderry District Council to change its name to the Derry District Council under the law, without, of course, changing the name of Derry or Londonderry. Now, this was surreal, but that's what politics was. I was the minister of treachery. So I think you shouldn't underestimate what's changed, but I recognize that you're necessary because there's more that needs to be done.
But stupidly, I say, if you take the violence out of the question, 30 years of violence, in terms of community relations, despite all the work that has been done, we still have the peace walls. And no one who lives on either side of them wants, in principle they might want them to come down, but in practice they certainly don't. And again, the political hierarchies are still showing a great lack of trust.
Yeah, I think that's true. On the peace walls, the first decision I had to make as a minister, because I did most of the normal side of life, as it were, and the first decision I had to make, there was a new housing estate which had been built with a wall down the middle, and Catholics were going to move in on one side and Protestants on the other. And I was told that nobody would move in because the wall wasn't high enough. And I said, but it's higher than the Berlin Wall. And they said, no, it's not high enough. There has to be another 1.5 meters on the top. And much against all my liberal instincts, I ticked it off. I agreed to it. So I'm not unaware of the fact that some of those antipathies and hatred still exist. But I hope that just as some people seem to have forgotten the past of one or two of the political parties, they'll forget some of the ancient antipathies as well. And the sooner political debate is about whether you want to spend more money or whether you want to spend more, whether you want to cut more taxes, the better.
I was hoping the Chief Constable might have asked this question, but he declined my invitation. We are still talking, or we are talking again about 50-50, which, as you say, the parties, unlikely parties, bought into 20 years ago, but it hasn't produced the balance that was expected. Well, I think it's something like 31% now, Catholic. And people are saying we need it again, and the unions are saying, no, we don't. This is ridiculous. Of course we don't. We need to do it on merit.
The reason, of course, merit is important. But it's also important to ensure that the police are taken out of the cockpit of politics. And it's very important that police aren't shot in the appalling industrial quantities that they were in the past, or blown to smithereens. And it's important that they're not the sort of fulcrum of angry political debate. And you can't do that if part of the community thinks that policing is to protect the interests of the other part of the community. Now, when we did our report, the proportion of Catholics in the police force was 8. And it's now 31, 32. And I think that's, given what you said about the difficulties of making a go of power sharing in Stormont, I think that's pretty good progress. Whether or not you need to go back to 50-50 seems to me to be a matter which I'm sure is best resolved between the Equality Commission and the Chief Constable, the senior officers of the PSNI. But I just want to add one point. Everybody always focuses, understandably, on the Catholic-Protestant, Protestant-Catholic balance. What about the gender balance? The gender balance, again, when we wrote our report, and I'm speaking from memory, I think was about, there were about 8%, just over 8%. It certainly wasn't as much as 10% women. And it's now probably above 30, but still less than it should be. One of the reasons for which I suspect is that push and pull test, which I think women are still obliged to do, which tests upper body strength. Whether that is a sensible way of proceeding, I don't know. But I remember talking to a chief of police in, I think it was Baltimore, and saying, what's your ideal police officer? And he said, a black grandmother. he said,
we haven't even talked about ethnic minorities.
If I had a few more African American grandmothers, we'd be in a much better position in dealing with crime and dealing with the community.
Yeah, I mean, again, you talk very much about the need for transparency and about the Good Friday Agreement being a sophisticated tool, but people have pointed out time and time again that its success lay in its constructive obfuscation, which was a way of sandpapering over, or rather papering over, the cracks that were there. So those two things seem to be at odds: transparency and honesty, and constructive obfuscation.
I'm not sure that it obfuscates. And I think that the people who signed up to it knew perfectly well that there was a deal in which, as I said earlier, one community accepted that it could only get constitutional change through consent and through democracy. The other community recognized that in return for that, the still minority community, though probably not for much longer, didn't have to sign up to all these symbols and emblems of a unionist state. And I think that was a pretty clear bargain, and it was certainly one which we understood during the policing commission and didn't think we could fudge when it came to policing, though there was a lot of pain around when we took those decisions. But I think the fact that it worked is a great tribute to the senior officers in the police service.
I do want to throw it open to throw, but I would like to ask you about Hong Kong. Obviously, it's faded from the headlines a little bit because of COVID-19. Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, has been saying that there are clearly violent protests on the streets, in her words. And she asked the question, what would you do if those protests were on the streets of London or Dublin?
Well, the fact is that, thank God they're not, because we haven't made the assumption that you can replace politics with tear gas. This could have ended a long time ago if, for example, as well as dropping the extradition treaty proposed more rapidly, the government had accepted the case for a public inquiry into the demonstrations, the policing of them, and as well as the behavior of the demonstrators. The behavior of a small fringe of the demonstrators is in no way acceptable. It's understandable, and the community in Hong Kong understands it, which is why in the latest elections, they overwhelmingly supported the demonstrators and those who represented them politically. So I think that I learned enough about public order policing when I was here to know that you don't use tear gas incontinently. You don't use plastic baton rounds as though you're on a rabbit shoot. You don't use pepper spray in people's faces. You don't use undercover officers in a way which provokes violence. You make sure that police officers' numbers are visible on their uniforms. All those things which are pretty basic policing. The police service, when I was in Hong Kong, not very many years ago, was hugely popular. And the Interpol statistics showed that crime in Hong Kong was lower than in Singapore, which Lee Kuan Yew used to hate me telling him. But we didn't have to do it with the help of canes or hanging. The police service has been used by the government, or above all by Beijing, as a substitute for politics. And it's not dissimilar to what used to happen here. And it is unfair to police officers and unfair to their families.
The agreement which led to your departure was the joint declaration, which again has echoes here, of course. You have said that you feel that you failed, or there was a failure to establish, I guess what would it be? You talked in your address about that identity of Hong Kong wanting to define their Chineseness in a frame that they were familiar with, a democratic frame, if you like. But you've said that you didn't do enough to establish that political accountability and that, therefore, to concretize that sense of identity, perhaps. Do you still feel that?
That's not quite how I would put it. And it's what is true is these kids and other people who are demonstrating aren't being manipulated by me or others. They actually accept the same view of the good society that you or I would accept. I think the problem for us was that from an early stage, say the 50s or 60s, we went along with the Chinese assumption that we couldn't do what we'd done in every other colony, which was to prepare it for independence by introducing democracy. And Zhou Enlai, for example, the very famous Chinese prime minister under Mao, sent messages to the British government saying, don't start introducing democracy in Hong Kong, because if you do so, people in Hong Kong will think they're going to be independent, that they're going to be like Singapore or Malaysia, and that isn't going to happen. And to some extent, I think until the mid-1980s, and certainly until Tiananmen, which changed the political mood in Hong Kong quite a bit, to some extent, people used that as a bit of an excuse. People used to say, even when I was in Hong Kong, people in Hong Kong aren't interested in politics, they're only interested in making money. I mean, crazy stuff like that. So I think we should have started on the development of more limited forms of democracy earlier, and we should have been prepared from time to time to argue more vigorously with China. I was treated as a democratic hero for doing a negligible amount, but trying to make elections fair and trying to make sure that the judicial system worked well, that there were foreign judges on the Court of Final Appeal and so on. But I was turned into a democratic hero by some of the things that the Chinese news agency and apparatchiks said about me. But it saved me from being hammered by Emily Lau and Martin Lee and others.
In 10 years' time, where do you think Hong Kong will be?
Well, in 10 years' time, if Hong Kong is much as it's been for the last, much as it was from 1997 until Xi Jinping became Lord High Emperor in 2012 or so, if Hong Kong is like that, it won't be a bad thing. It may be a lot better than that. If it's worse than that, it will be a sign of how difficult the Chinese are going to make life in the 21st century, because they feel threatened by liberal democracy. I made a speech yesterday in Dublin about this, in memory of Peter Sutherland. They feel, and for them, for hardline Chinese communist apparatchiks, the things that Hong Kong seems to represent are things which they think are a threat to totalitarianism. And, I mean, at the moment, I salute the courage and hard work of so many medical professionals, health workers, doctors in China. But we all know that the secrecy, which is part of an authoritarian state, almost certainly stopped earlier measures being taken to deal, because the local authorities in Wuhan and Hubei, Hebei, were reluctant to tell their senior officials what was happening.
What was happening?
Secrecy is always an aspect of totalitarian regimes, and if you look at some of the before it was stopped, some of the internet traffic in the early stages after, particularly when that brave doctor died, it shows that people in China know what's been happening.
So some people have suggested the Chinese quite like showing that they can close down a place like Wuhan province. Do you think there's any Machiavellian influence?
No, not really. I think that the fact that they sacked most of those in political control of both Wuhan and Hebei province demonstrates that they don't think it went terribly well.
Right, enough of me. Let's have some questions from the floor. There's a first hand up. Is this person just 5 rows back there? Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Brian O'Neill. With the rise of English nationalism, do you think that in the future English taxpayers might get fed up giving us 10 billion a year and we might be told to leave the Union and take Scotland with us?
No, I don't, but I do worry about the rise of English nationalism, and I do worry that in a lot of the polling that was done before the last election, it demonstrated that a large majority of Conservative voters thought that, quote, getting Brexit done, unquote, was more important than Scotland remaining part of the United Kingdom, and was more important than safeguarding the Good Friday Agreement. That shows a sort of insular recklessness, which I think politicians should be tackling head-on rather than fomenting.
But can I just interrupt you? Do you think nationalism and populism are the same thing?
I think they're usually the same thing. I think it's usually the case that populists are nationalists, and there's a huge difference between being a nationalist and a patriot. I'll give you an example which I've used before, about 2 speeches given by a former Member of Parliament in Northern Ireland, Enoch Powell. In 1961, on St. George's Day, he made a wonderfully written, slightly loopy speech about English nationalism. Parish churches, hedgerows, Gertrude Jekyll gardens, and so on and so on. And he suggested in general terms that this is under threat. And he finishes up by quoting Herodotus. And he says that you'll all remember, I think he was speaking in Wolverhampton, I'm not sure they did all remember, that passage in Herodotus when the Athenians come back to Athens after they'd left and it's been burnt to a cinder by the Persians. And in the middle of the destruction, there is one olive tree growing and throwing out green shoots. And he says, one day we'll come back to our own country and see the proud English oak doing this. You can imagine this. I mean, bonkers, but beautifully written. Nobody took a blind bit of notice. 6, 7 years later, he made that famous speech in Wolverhampton again, in which he talked about nationalism, he talked about grinning piccaninnies and old ladies having excreta pushed through their letterboxes. And people noticed then. Dockers were marching in London, auto workers were marching in the West Midlands. And nationalism, in order to tickle a nerve, always requires the other, requires the enemy within or without. He talked in that second speech about the immigrant, the black man, having the whip hand, the deliberately chosen metaphor whose consequence he knew very well. And you see again and again that when a patriot talks about love for his country or her country, you don't feel under any obligation to glamorize its institutions, to snowpeg bits of its history. You recognize its mistakes, you recognize its virtues, and you love it above all when it displays those virtues to others internationally and makes the world a better place. That's being a patriot. Think of George Orwell, who was a patriot, thought that nationalism was about revenge and defeat and victory. And
just to come back to the question, Chris, I mean, why do you think the increasingly nationalist or populist English electorate might not say, we're fed up with Northern Ireland? If it's easier for them to trade north and south, why don't they just come together?
Well, I hope they won't. Nobody has actually faced them with the consequences or whether they really want to risk the future of the United Kingdom. It's not just about money. Does anybody really suppose that if the United Kingdom were to break up, we'd still be a member of the Security Council? Do you think the rest of the world would allow that to happen? There are all sorts of consequences which people need to be aware of. And it doesn't help if you don't tell them the truth. It doesn't help if you feed delusions about what lies ahead. It doesn't help if, since you know there are going to be some difficult negotiations with Europe in the next few months, you whip up the tabloid press to give the impression that it's these bloody French, Germans, Krauts, Wops, all making trouble again against gallant little Blighty. I mean, it's terrible stuff. Even worse, of course, is whipping up populist opinion against the courts and the judges, enemies of the people. When the government goes off and lies to the Queen, and the Supreme Court points out that this isn't really a very good idea, is taking back control really about proroguing Parliament. It's not the way democratic governments should behave.
We go back to, and yes, keep going back that row, second person. I don't have my distance glasses on, so.
Thanks, Monica McWilliams, former Commissioner, the Chief
Hello.
Commissioner of Human Rights. Chris, thank you so much for that talk, and once again I have the opportunity to thank you for the Patten report, which made such a difference here. And you started the talk about talking about the centrality of human rights and policing, and the changes that has made. But you said you thought the policing was an outstanding issue and too difficult. But there is a difficult issue at the minute, and both commissions are probably wrestling with it. And it's not just because of Brexit. It was in the peace agreement, in terms of your identity politics, for here the right to be British, Irish, or both. It's never been resolved. It's not justiciable. And so my question is, if you were here now and on a commission, what advice would you give?
About whether it should be possible to carry both a British and an Irish passport.
Yes, that's the question. Yeah, yeah. It's about identity again, isn't it?
Yeah, but I know.
It's actually something that wasn't resolved. There was meant to be a Bill of Rights in the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, the government, as you know, is against.
Yes, because it would have made Northern Ireland a separate place. But in 2008, the Commission, the Human Rights Commission, which is hosting this tonight, passed over its advice. And there is the right to be British, Irish, or both, that's in the Good Friday Agreement. It has never been enshrined, it's never been enforced, and at the minute there is a case going on, and it's causing enormous difficulties right across Northern Ireland about how to resolve it. So all these years later, from the peace agreement, you spoke about consent, and you spoke about the importance of identity politics. So it's really important that we resolve that. Yep. Would you suggest to the current government that they should try and put forward a Bill of Rights with that right written into it?
I think you make a compelling case. The problem is that if I suggested it to the present government, it would probably solidify their hostility to it. But I know people who've got 2, 3 passports. I know people who've got a British and a French passport. I know people who've got a British and a Spanish passport. I know people who've got a British and Swedish passport. And it shouldn't just be dogs that we allow this to happen to, partly because I've got a house for summer holidays in France, and dogs, I've always had dogs. My dogs have got French passports as well as British passports. They can.
But it's
travel
got-
back.
it's
But I mean,
going
if you
to
can do it for dogs, you should be able to do it for human
Yeah.
beings.
It's going to come up, as more and more people in Northern Ireland get
Yeah, sure.
Irish passports
Sure.
post-Brexit. So, I mean, is it that should you have all the rights of a citizen of each country to which you have a passport?
Yeah, I think you should. There are certain obligations you would have depending on where you were working and where you were making your living. But I see no problem. The Americans take a rather different view, hence the fact that Mr. Murdoch, born in Australia, is an American citizen.
Helps if you've got $10 billion.
Yeah, it does. It helps. It sort of oils the way. But can I tell one story about
Go,
that?
of course.
When Mr. Murdoch, who'd bought a satellite station in Hong Kong, was trying to get it, I mean, he dropped the BBC from it in order to curry favor from the Chinese. But the Chinese were still not letting him into China, so he got an appointment in Beijing. It's a true story, this, with Zhu Rongji, the then premier. And he explained how he wanted to have his satellite operating in China. And Zhu Rongji said to him, "Is it true, Mr. Murdoch, that you were born in Australia?" And he said, "Yes, it was true." And then Zhu Rongji said to him, "And is it true, Mr. Murdoch, that in order to buy Fox News and an American newspaper, you became an American citizen?" And rather nervously, Murdoch said yes. So Zhu Rongji said, with all his officials around him giggling, "So, Mr. Murdoch, if your television station operates in China, are you intending to become a Chinese citizen?"
Well, you never know. Let's move to this side of the room. I saw some hands up. Thought I did. Oh, no. Yes, right. Very back row there, then, please. Keeping to this side of the room. 3-0 to this side of the room. You got it? You got it? Sorry, very back row. At this side. Gentleman with the beard. Again, I'm sorry, I can't see your face because I don't have the right glasses on.
Sorry, thank you. A question for Lord Patten.
Just tell us who you are.
Sorry. My name is Paul Murray. I'm a mental health support worker in the NHS. A question now for Mr. Patten or Lord Patten is, given 3 roles that you had, the Patten Report, Northern Ireland, the Governor of Hong Kong, also the Director General of the BBC, when the Saville Report was published, do you feel that the latter role, as Director General of the BBC, that your authority or the power that you would have had in the previous 2 positions, here and in Hong Kong, was in any way hampered because of the implications of the Saville Report?
Yeah, a lot of people who'd advised me not to do the policing commission, not to go to Hong Kong, not to go to Brussels as a European Commissioner. And I'd loved each one of those jobs, so I thought they were wrong. Also, particularly people who work for the BBC, in 1 or 2 cases, advised me not to become chairman of the BBC Trust. And I thought, well, they were wrong about those other things, and maybe they're wrong about this. The trouble about the Trust was that it didn't have any power. I didn't run the BBC, but with my colleagues on the Trust, we were held responsible for everything that went wrong. So when we tried to tackle an issue of like pay, Mark Thompson, the Director General, in effect said, "Get your tanks off my lawn. It's not your responsibility." And there were other examples as well. So it was a hugely frustrating job. I think the BBC is one of our most important national institutions, hugely respected around the world, the best public service broadcaster in the world. I do not want to live in a world where I depend on Fox News to find out what's going on. I don't want to live in a world where the news I can get access to is decided by algorithms set by clever people in Northern California in order, among other things, to try to maximize the amount of money they've got. I think the BBC is a real treasure. And if I'd been able to do it while being a proper chairman of the board running the BBC, and there is now that structure in place, I would have been delighted. But you know why the BBC Trust was set up? Because of a terrible error, one of the few errors that the BBC made during the Iraq War. And a sort of punishment. The trust was set up to try to rein it in, but it was a terrible, terrible.
So do you feel that you used your power to the extent that you were structurally able to in the
Savile I was probably too conscious of the limits of my power. The Savile stuff, the main issue that should have affected us was not the historic horror story, but the fact that a program made about him by Newsnight was then canned. And trying to get to the bottom of that was a real problem.
Cost one Director General.
Cost an exceptionally nice Director General called George Entwistle, who was only in the job briefly. And was overwhelmed by it.
I don't know if you were in the country with the Sunday Times headlines a couple of weeks ago about the government's plans for the BBC. I'm gathering you'd be rather opposed to a large-scale sell-off.
Well, if the government is intent on eliminating every check or balance on its executive authority, then we're going to find we're living in a very different country. And I think the BBC has, even during the worst days of the Savile crisis, trust in the BBC, measured by opinion polls, never reported, of course, in the popular media. Trust in the BBC was stratospherically higher than in any other media organization, particularly newspapers, which were down to 1-2% in comparison with the BBC. The BBC, at the height of the Savile scandals, was the fourth most popular institution in the country. The Queen, the armed forces, the NHS, and then the BBC.
Next one. No one from this. Oh yes, there's a gentleman or someone. I do beg your pardon. I can't see. Yeah, I do see a beard. Is there a beard? Yeah, a little.
Hi, my name is Patrick Yu from Northern Ireland Council for Racial Equality. I'm a British Hong Kongese. I greeting you as Fei Pang. At least now you know that there's some people from Hong Kong, we love you. My question it is about the Bill of Rights. I think before I came to here first, I introduced the Bill of Rights to our friends in the CAJ. So it was my first encounter. I think you did remember when Hong Kong get the Bill of Rights, you get all those opposition from China, from the foreign ministry and everything against to set up the Bill of Rights in Hong Kong. But now the Bill of Rights still there. It also become one of the central pillars of the Court of Final Appeal to protect the human rights protection in Hong Kong. Now my question going back to Northern Ireland, why the government they against it? Because the politician doesn't have something. But if you see your experience in Hong Kong, you find out why it is so important. Could you share some experience on that? The second question I would like to ask is about the learning from both sides. Hong Kong is very famous on the economic lead to the global society. In Northern Ireland, we are the other way around. We more politics lead. I think I'm going back to your question or your discussion about transparency. How we learn that transparency? We have the forthcoming report of Cash for Ash coming soon. Thank you.
Transparency in Hong Kong, how you you talked about it so much in terms of Northern Ireland and policing, but in terms of, I guess, dealing with the authorities and the bureaucracy of Hong Kong, how does it apply there?
Well, it's partly a question of the way the government operates from day to day. It's partly a question of how the media see their role. And at the moment, for example, for following what happens in Hong Kong, I depend hugely on crowd-funded free press. There's a Hong Kong Free Press organization which is largely made up of people who no longer want to work for some of the mainstream media because they've all been gutted, either by those who owned them or in other ways. So you need a robust media, which sometimes, if you're in government, annoys you like hell, but is still the price you pay for government, for a democracy. You also need, I think, to operate more openly. Now, I used to do, when I was in Hong Kong, a lot of radio phone-ins, and I used to do public meetings like this or bigger, which was quite brave because I didn't speak any Cantonese. I used to have the same sort of 4 or 5 phrases in Cantonese, which Willie Whitelaw used to use in English with a crowd. Wonderful to see you, lovely you've come, thank you so much, children look wonderful. I had about 4 or 5 phrases like that, which I always hoped I was getting right tonally. But I used to do big public meetings, and people would come and ask any question they wanted, but I was dependent on my interpreter in my ear. I remember one occasion, the first one in Sha Tin, in the town hall in Sha Tin, huge hall, and I was asked a question which interpreted, and the question seemed to be about services for the deaf, about which I knew absolutely damn all. So I did what all politicians do in the circumstances. I waffled enthusiastically and started talking about what we were doing in order to provide more testing, ear testing for the deaf and so on. And the meeting started to giggle. The word for the deaf is like farmers in Cantonese. So I'd actually been asked what we were doing for farmers. So there were perils. There were perils in being open, but I think it's very important that governments should be as open as possible. So in this country, when ministers decide in a sort of childish way, or when the Prime Minister decides that ministers are no longer allowed to go on the Today programme because the questions are too difficult, it's ridiculous, and it's curtailing people's right to ensure that the government is as open as possible. And I think in Hong Kong, you need a more open style of government.
What do you think of what Carrie Lam is saying to the people of Hong Kong? Is there any transparency there at all?
Not really, no. I think she's unfortunately in a position where she doesn't feel able to say anything which she hasn't already cleared with Beijing. I think it's a sort of, there's a transmission mechanism which starts in Beijing and arrives in Hong Kong, and it's extremely sad. It involves sort of preemptive cringing before you make a decision, among other things. She's not a bad person, but she's just...
you talk about preemptive cringing. One other thing I know you've written about, in dealing with China in general in the world, treat them with respect, but don't kowtow, no cringing.
Yes, that's exactly my view. I think that it's very important that China does well economically. I think it should have a proper central role given its size and importance in the international community. But I don't think it should be able to play the game by its own rules. I think it needs to use what's becoming what Ernie Bevan used to call the clitch of our age. It needs to operate on a level playing field, not on a playing field which is like that. On Bill of Rights, I think I you were asking whether I thought that what I'd experienced in Hong Kong was relevant here, is that right? Not entirely. But I do think that the sort of rights which we regard as important in any free society, whether you incorporate them in a Bill of Rights or whether you deal with them in another way, in other ways, I think that is very, very important. It's worth remembering that the European Convention on Human Rights, which right-wing conservatives now rail against, was something that we helped to draft and get other people to accept back in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm being told we have to end. Just as all the hands are going, what kept you? I fear our time is up, Les, and so, Lord Patten, thank you very much indeed. We could talk all night, of course, but I know you've had a long day, so thank you for your time this evening. Les is going to come up and say a few words of...
Chris and Noel, thank you very much. With the theme of openness and transparency, we have to leave this building by 8:30. There is a soft drink reception immediately after this. I just want to say a few very quick thanks. First of all, thank all of you for coming out this evening. Thank you to our guest speaker, Chris Patten, an absolutely fascinating insight into this archipelago, to use that phrase. One small fragment, I think, of the legacy of the Patten Commission, and it was a commission. I've only ever heard 3 chief constables talk in very positive, glowing terms about human rights-based policing and about the value of the Human Rights Act. Hugh Ord, George Hamilton, and Simon Byrne. And I don't think it's any coincidence that one of the legacies of the Patten Commission and its work is the recognition of the value of human rights-based policing in Northern Ireland. I want to briefly both thank the Equality Commission and Human Rights Commission staff for helping make this happen, to thank the City Council for this wonderful building, and the Mayor of Belfast for those important words at the beginning of the event. But also finally just to acknowledge this is the penultimate day of Michael Wardlow's tenure. He's spent 8 years as a champion of equality issues within the Commission, to welcome very warmly Geraldine into the role and to wish her the very best of luck. And to say, please stay briefly for the reception afterwards, and then safe home. And thank you very much, and perhaps one final round of applause for Chris Patten.